Okay, welcome to Out of the Fire podcast, episode 2 with Darren Devitt. Welcome.
Thanks, Gene. Good to be here.
I really would like to get started with just tell people a little bit about yourself. So I think everybody kind of, at least folks that are into fire, have seen you in your posts on LinkedIn, but I'm not sure people know like where you're from and how you got into this. So maybe that's how we could get started.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a fire advisor and consultant. I work with a lot of different medtech companies in the US and in Europe. Generally speaking, I work alongside their kind of project leaders or technical architects as they build out their solutions. So sharing my experiences, offering my advice, that kind of thing. I got into fire a number of years ago. I was working on the technical side back then as a contractor, and I started working for a US company based in Ireland on a 6-month contract. That was my introduction to fire. And I kind of stuck with it ever since. So like you said, I also write about fire every week on my website and post some of that content to LinkedIn as well. Some of your listeners may have read some of those posts. I'm also working on a book about fire that I just started a couple of months back, kind of doing the research on that now and getting things started. Kind of my attempt, I see it to fill in what I see as a kind of gap in the fire documentation and the fire community, really. So looking forward to the next year on that. I'd say it'll be an interesting year and a long year, I think.
Wow. So some really cool news here that we're hearing, Darren. A book. Wow. That's really great. I don't think I have seen many books about fire, but I think it would be really good. Are you aiming for a particular audience with that?
Yeah. So I'm kind of basing it on the work I've been doing for the past few years. So the target user of this book, target reader of this book would be a project leader or a technical leader, say technical architect, starting on a big fire project within their organization or business. Quite often, when organizations encounter fire for the first time, it's a new project, they bring in new people, a lot of newness going on, a lot of learning going on. And generally speaking, they're technical people, and quite often their product people have to learn about fire for the very first time. So they're doing a lot of reading, a lot of research, visiting the communities. And what I found based on my experience was that even though the fire documentation is very, very comprehensive, there's lots of good stuff in there, it tends to fall down a little when it comes to helping architects and project leaders build out the fully fledged solution. So it gives you a lot of information, say, about a fire resource type, the search parameters, the bits and pieces like the elements, and even the terminology, but how you go about architecting that solution, how you implement your data flows, whether you build a facade on top of your own database or data warehouse, whether you use a managed fire server, whether you go with a hybrid approach, all these extra kind of architectural pieces that need to be built by the technical teams over 1, 2, even 3 years. The advice on that just isn't there. So that's kind of what I'm trying to target here in this book. So you're a new person coming to fire, a new technical architect, project leader. What are all the things you need to know? What are the options available to you?
Got it. In terms of the story, and how are you thinking that part of your experience in learning fire is going to be something that's represented in this book, and how you were able to get started with it, and some of the, I would say, pain points that a lot of people see? Are you going to put some of those lessons learned in the book?
I think so, yeah. The starting point was my own experiences and the different companies I've worked with, and that pretty much only takes me so far. So when I said earlier it's a year-long project, that's because I'm going to have to talk to a lot of different people to see how they handled the problems I've dealt with in the past as well, to work out what the different options are and so on. I was at Dev Days a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to a lot of different people there about some of the same kind of problems to see how they solve those problems. And many of the people are looking at the same problems, but coming up with different solutions. Really, some of these problems, some of these solution areas, it's not as if there's one way of doing it. Quite often there might be 7 or 8 ways of doing it, or maybe 2 or 3 good ways of doing it. An example might be, say you're building a multi-tenant architecture into your fire data flow. You have, whether it's multiple hospitals, multiple regions, multiple countries even, how are you building or implementing that multi-tenancy? And there are many different ways of doing that. Similarly, you could have, maybe you want to implement attribute-based access control or element-level access control. And again, there are lots of different, well, I won't say lots, there are a number of different approaches that can be taken to that. I know how Samurai have recently built ABAC into their fire servers directly, but quite often if you're using a different fire server provider, you'll need to implement this yourself, or your technical team will. So it's good to get the different options and the different ways of doing this out there, so that if you're the technical architect and you're coming to this problem, you want to implement ABAC, what are the 2 or 3 recognized ways of doing this, and which one of these 2 or 3 would best fit into your existing architecture and meet your requirements and so on.
One of the interesting things that Graham said in the last episode is FHIR is not a data platform. What do you think about that? And FHIR being in specification, but also implementation of the specification is kind of part of FHIR, right? So what do you say about people that say that, you can't extend it without building it as a platform and as a service, perhaps all the way out to like being a full data platform? What are your thoughts on that?
I remember maybe a year ago listening to an old video that Graham was on again. Not sure how long ago it was, maybe 2-3 years ago he made the video, and he was talking about managed FHIR servers, which as you know are a growing trend. Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, Health Samurai and others are doing the same thing. And I think if memory serves me right, what he was saying was when he came up with FHIR and started working on it initially, he never envisaged there being a managed FHIR server. The expectation was you would have your databases or your data warehouses, and you would implement the API on top using the data standard and so on. And these managed servers just didn't have a place in his mind at that time. So they popped up to fill a need. And I know there's a bit of, I would say a lot of, I won't say controversy, but strong opinions either way as to how they should be used. Because quite often these managed FHIR servers, they behave sometimes as if they were the database itself, which of course they're not. They're simply an API on top of an existing database, and you don't see that database yourselves. So if you're new to FHIR and you're coming to this for the first time and you're seeing, say, a managed server on AWS or on Azure, it can look very much like it's your data repository and it should stay that way. And I've seen solutions that implement on the back of that assumption, for good or ill. So my experience has been that once projects start to grow beyond, say, the first year or two and the knowledge deepens, people start to look at this and question why they're doing it this way, especially when you start looking at the wider use cases for the data that you're storing in this FHIR server. Like maybe you have an analytical requirement and you want to synchronize that data with a data warehouse or flatten it out using SQL and FHIR. Or maybe there's a central data warehouse or data repository elsewhere and you're syncing with the FHIR server in some way, or you're pulling data in from that central data repository in some way. So it can be very unclear as to the role the FHIR server, especially the managed FHIR server, should play in your whole architecture and what you should be doing with that data. Are you persisting the data? Is it staying there for a long time? Is it just flowing into your FHIR server temporarily while you use it for a particular purpose, then it gets deleted? So yeah, it's very much, I won't say it's a gray area, but it can be hard to get your head around sometimes into what you're implementing. So if you had, say, your existing data warehouse and you were implementing the FHIR facade yourself, you were building the API on top, you were exposing the few resource types you might be exposing, and you were building the entire API, it would be a much clearer data flow. You're simply implementing an API on top of your existing database, wherever that is. So a lot of questions to answer around that. And some of them I hope to try and answer or cast some light on in this book.
And I think that's a critical point you're making, which is an API is different than a traditional data warehouse, a traditional database. And I think I've seen that point of confusion amongst a variety of people that are executives, business leaders, product managers, that it work the same way as a traditional database. So in that aspect of it, what do you feel one of the biggest pain points I'm hearing, and again, out in the industry, in particularly, I think the large health insurance companies, large companies that have invested in a big data stack over the years, millions, hundreds of millions, $1 billion is not unheard of. And they need to plug in FHIR somewhere. So what I'm hearing is that it's very difficult because essentially it's almost like you have an infrastructure for combustion engine car that uses gasoline, and all of your infrastructure is built for that. So you have a gas station in your neighborhood, you have your garage, everything mechanic, everybody knows how to work with internal combustion car. And when you introduce an electric car, which is akin to introducing FHIR, you need to have infrastructure set up for that. So as an example, plugging FHIR data into a relational database, having it be accessible to existing workflows so that your existing systems can, utilize, your analysts can build dashboards, reports, things like that. What can you say about your experience with that? And are we turning the corner with that a little bit? I, in my experience, have seen some very promising things, but I'm not sure we're there. I still see a lot of confusion. I see a lot of I would say, unnecessary difficulty in adopting FHIR because of that. It's not connected to the plumbing of the existing systems. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say, going back to what you said earlier, there's a lot of education to do in the business about what FHIR is. So the technical people can get their head around what FHIR is, I would say, relatively quickly. It's an API, there's some kind of database somewhere behind it. But quite often within business and within organizations, they see, well, the data's flowing in, it's being stored, it's coming out. Therefore, why is it different to a database? So getting them to understand that can be quite difficult, and getting them to understand the limitations of FHIR can be very difficult as well. For example, if we had, say, a traditional relational database like Postgres, and we were storing all of our data there, and we were accessing it again via an API, which probably you would be, it can be relatively straightforward, say, building your dashboards and pulling out all your metrics from that database, because that's what databases are for, essentially. So it can be difficult to get the management of a business to understand that FHIR can't do that out of the box, that you've got to, like you said, build the different infrastructure around the FHIR server that lets you do that. And one of the difficulties I've seen is that there often isn't one way of doing this. There could be a multitude of different ways. Like that one example you gave of showing, say, a dashboard with whatever metrics you want to show on it, and maybe the data is coming out of FHIR in some way. You could be using SQL on FHIR to flatten out your data. It could end up syncing with the Postgres database. Maybe you'd have a degree of anonymization even before it goes into that Postgres database. But if you're on a platform like Microsoft Azure, they have their own data warehouse, Fabric, which they expect you to synchronize your FHIR server to. And they have well-documented ways of doing that, and they have steps inside their Azure portal to do that. And Google Cloud have, of course, BigQuery, and they synchronize with BigQuery automatically on a FHIR server. You set up a new FHIR server on Google Cloud, there's a checkbox you just tick and it syncs automatically with BigQuery. But again, there'd be a lot of work involved in terms of building around your FHIR server to make sure the data flow is right and the right data is flowing in and the anonymization is applied and so on. I mean, that's just one example of what you might want to build around a FHIR server to enable the extra functionality. But there's a lot more than that as well. Like I gave a talk at Dev Days there, the first talk I gave about building a proxy around a FHIR server, which in my experience, most implementations of a FHIR server, when you're using, say, an off-the-shelf FHIR server, will involve, your technical teams will have to build some kind of wrapper around the server, intercept your requests on the way in, maybe intercept the responses on the way out, because that degree of extra functionality is required if you want to implement what might be seen as basic things like RBAC or attribute-based access control or custom operations or all of these extra things that you want to add. So the FHIR server itself, especially a commercial grade FHIR server, is usually very, very short on these extra features. It gives you the API, it gives you the search parameters, it gives you some of the extras. Maybe it implements subscriptions to a degree, but probably not completely. So it gives you pretty much the basics, but it doesn't give you anything else that your business might require. So your technical team have to build all that. Management team need to understand the extra time involved in building all of that, which sometimes can be 1 or 2 years on large projects. So I'd say a lot of this comes down to education, but I haven't really seen much signs of kind of uniformity in some of these areas. So there'll be 2 or 3, like I said, different ways of doing the same thing. That talk I gave at Dev Days about FHIR proxies, I was kind of happy to see a lot of agreement in the audience. Like, we built something similar, we call it something else, that kind of thing. But it wasn't universal. I posted about this, say, on my website before. I've had negative feedback from some people, like, why would you need that? Definitely don't need that, So there isn't a uniform approach to any of this in the community yet. There's, I'd say, admission that there's complexity, but I think some of it comes down to the fact that there's such diversity in projects that use FHIR. Like, a private business is building something in one way, a government organization is building something completely different in a different way, and their interoperability requirements are very, very different. And then you have a host of other use cases sitting somewhere between these two. And everyone, of course, is working on their own implementation, communicating with their own people who are doing something similar. And they have sometimes this picture that this is the way all FHIR projects should be, when really there is this huge diversity across the board.
Absolutely. It comes to mind when I'm designing FHIR profiles, or I'm building a solution or an implementation for FHIR. I have the full benefit of the community behind it. So as an example, I can say, when, let's say, I'm looking at how to implement a medication list, I did look at how that medication list was implemented in the UK. I think the Netherlands, Germany, there's like N number of implementations out there. Some of them might have been years ago, some of them might have been more recently. And then there's also active efforts ongoing where there's a working group trying to implement that for specific use cases, it's very beneficial. What is your thoughts on really, it's both a benefit and a burden of having to reconcile that as well. So how do you pick which implementation you should deploy when there is multiple ways of doing things?
Yeah, that's a difficult one to answer. I think when you're working for private businesses, private organizations, the answer is often different because the priorities are different. And quite often the priorities are very, not immediate, they're short. The timeframes involved can be shorter. So if you're working for a private business and they're building something with, say, a 2-3 year timeline and they're rolling out a release, say, in 12 months, you don't always have the luxury of going along to all the connectathons and talking to the people you should be talking to in the community to maybe come to a consensus. I mean, that's the ideal. And that's what you see quite often on the chat forum, the FHIR chat forum. And it would be great if everyone had the time to do that. Because like yourself, I've encountered more than one implementation guide doing the same thing. And I've worked on an implementation guide, say, in the same space. And I've looked at the existing implementation guide and thought, well, that part's not quite right, or I wouldn't have done it that way. And the business doesn't want that. So we have to kind of do it ourselves, which is good for the business, but it's not great for the community because you end up with 2 implementation guides, 3 implementation guides that are all a little different, none of which would satisfy the next organization who comes along wanting the same thing because it's not generic enough or it's too precise to a particular use case. So it's a very difficult one to answer, I think. I don't know the answer to the short answer. How do we bring the wider community that is not involved deeply into the community, more into the community, really?
Do you feel like FHIR needs to be more focused on, because to your point, not everybody gets to go to the connectathons. And even if you wanted to, I think that there's now something on the order of 50 different working groups in HL7 working on FHIR projects. It's just simply impossible for anybody to be involved in all of them. And also at the same point, there are different timelines for, digital health startups versus a large health plan versus a large provider organization and the EHR vendor. They all have different priorities, different timelines, which the connectathon really doesn't always align with, right? Do you think FHIR should be more flexible and more towards agile, I would say, way of working rather than more waterfall, as we have experience kind of just building a spec for many, many years, getting to a point where you could get the consensus, which takes a really long time, which is necessary, but also how do you deal with those priorities and more agile ways of that occurs out there in most companies?
Yeah, I would say I don't think it's the FHIR community or the HL7 organization's necessarily responsibility to manage all of these implementation guides. It's too big for that. There's too many to be done. There's too much work to be done. And they're quite a small organization and most of them are volunteers. So I think that it would be great if we could see more involvement from these private organizations who are doing a lot of the work that we're not seeing, maybe publishing some of what they're doing. That would be very useful. I don't see how we can get around having variations, say, of the same implementation guide unless one of them rises to the top and becomes more prominent. I think that might happen over time as some of these projects and implementation guides mature more. Specific areas like maybe particular procedure types, you might have an implementation guide governing that, in which case there might be multiple different organizations and multiple different businesses who could make use of it. So if one of these implementation guides were to rise to the top and become the kind of de facto default implementation guide, then others would have to implement that. Maybe that's a way to do it, but I don't see how that can be kind of governed in any way.
Yep. Okay. What do you feel like is the next step in FHIR? What are you really excited about, Darren, in terms of you were at Dev Days? You probably had some really great conversations. What is your things that you're looking forward to with FHIR and where things are going?
I would say the spread, definitely, greater uptake of FHIR. There's a lot of talk at the conference and all across Europe recently about EHDS, the new European regulations coming in. There's implementation of that starting in many countries. A lot of open questions around it still, so a lot of uncertainty, I would say, in every organization is trying to implement it. But it would be great to see that kind of interoperability truly coming to European countries. My own country, Ireland, is very, very much lagging behind in this regard. It doesn't even have a HL7 affiliate right now, although there's some discussions taking place about that. So it would be great to see some of that being driven by the EHDS regulations, definitely. So looking also into the future, 6, as we know, is coming in a couple of years' time. That will hopefully involve a lot more or greater number of normalized resources, which is great to see. Very positive about that. But at the same time, I'm thinking, how long will it take before people who've adopted, organizations who've adopted R4 to make the move to R6? Say it's 2 years before R6 is released. It could easily be 3-4 more years before it's widely adopted because of the dominance of R4. So it's kind of very long term, but definitely great to see so many resource types will be normalized.
The famous debate if we're ever going to get it off R4.
Yeah.
It's not looking likely at this point. I think I ran a poll on my on the LinkedIn group that I have, and it was something like crazy, like 95%, 98% are using R4 still, and nobody has any plans to use anything else. But did you see something in R6 that will, first of all, make people's lives easier, but also like does not mean you have to do a whole bunch of work to transition?
The transition, yeah, this would be a concern of mine, the transitioning part of it, especially when you look at how many organizations are using these managed FHIR servers. So if you're locked into, say, Microsoft Azure and so on, and they use R4 only as the current managed server, I think they have an open source R5 server, but it's not a managed instance. And there's no indication that I've seen from Microsoft that they're starting work on R6. So if you're locked into, say, Microsoft Azure, your whole ecosystem's on Azure, I would be concerned about that. If you were thinking about moving, if you're not thinking about moving, if, like you said, you're stuck on R4 and planning to stay there, no problem. But yeah, it kind of raises the question then about managed FHIR servers versus kind of rolling your own or building your own facade. So you build your own facade, moving to R6 would not be that difficult. You know, you make a new version of your API, slight database changes underneath, and you're pretty much good to go. So yeah, tricky one to answer.
Can you talk about the difference between the managed FHIR server and the FHIR facade? I think a lot of people are confused about the difference. I think you're talking about the managed FHIR server is a complete solution that is kind of offered, thing that you basically put together. You choose the engine, you choose, like, let's say you have Postgres, or you have MongoDB underneath, and then you have a layer on top of it. Am I correct?
Yeah. Well, the managed FHIR server, say you're buying a managed FHIR server from AWS, Google, Azure, they will have implemented the API relatively completely, the FHIR API, whether it's R4 or R5. There would be a database underneath. I think in Microsoft's case, it's SQL Server now. It was something else before, but you don't have any exposure to the database at all. You can't run queries against the database. It's essentially a black box. So they're giving you an API, and that's pretty much it. You can post data via the API. You can get data via the API. What's going on in the background is concealed from you entirely. So pros and cons to that, but we won't go into that. If you were building a facade of your own, you're essentially implementing the API. So the underlying database or data warehouse, it may already exist. It may be your existing data repository wherever it is, or maybe a multitude of different databases or data repositories. You implement the FHIR API like you would any other API, and you populate the FHIR data objects to return from GET requests and so on in the same way. So you're basically implementing the API against your existing database or data warehouse.
In terms of level of effort, I think probably it depends on your end goal. The managed server is probably good for a quick start and a very easy time. And the other solution, which is you basically creating your own FHIR server, is a much more involved enterprise, correct?
It is, but I wouldn't necessarily be scared by that because it's a bigger project. If you were implementing your own FHIR facade, a good starting point might be to take one of the existing open source FHIR servers where the API is there, the data objects are already there, all the FHIR data types exist as data objects and so on. So you wouldn't be writing all the code yourself. But one of the advantages of implementing your own FHIR facade is, one, you wouldn't need to change your underlying database or data warehouse. That stays where it is, which is a very positive thing. And two, when you come to implement the FHIR API, you only implement the parts you need. So most organizations would not be exposing 145 resource types. You might maybe expose 15 or 20 for a particular use case, unless you're a fully fledged EHR. And even when you expose those 15 or 20 resource types, you might only need 2 or 3 of the search parameters for each resource type, because that's the particular way your consumers will be consuming the data. You don't have to implement everything. As long as you make it clear to people what you've implemented via your capability statement and so on, then you basically do the work you need to do and no more.
Absolutely. And that's where I feel like FHIR should always come with a disclaimer: know the problem you're trying to solve and what is your use case and how deeply you understand the use case. So to me, it's less of a technical problem than a business requirements problem. because your level of success and, the hoops you have to jump through and what you have to figure out, it largely depends on what it is you're trying to do and how you're trying to go about it. Just a big point of advice I think that you're giving Darren is make sure you bring in the business people and not just sit down with technology or IT or solution people and say, I need this. Really try to bring in the business people and the business problem you're trying to solve and start there, because FHIR is ultimately just an answer to how you get to that problem and you get a solution that works.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, most FHIR decisions are not technical at all. They require business knowledge to make. Some of them you mentioned yourself, but even things like regulations that might apply to the FHIR, the way you're implementing FHIR, your technical people are not going to know that. That business knowledge has to be brought in from the business. Your customer expectations, what they need and what they want. Again, the business will know that. Technical people won't. Even decisions like which FHIR version to use, or 4 or 5, leave it to your developers and they'll go with R5 because it's the latest version. But that's, again, like you said, that's not what most people want right now. So very much a business decision, and the business needs to be involved at every stage. I say business, but organization as well. Key stakeholders.
Yeah, really, everybody should be in the room that has a stake in it.
Very much so. Very much so.
Great. Some more. Those are great words to live by. I think as we see more and more organizations implementing FHIR, we see that, the importance of that repeatedly being brought to the surface. So, okay. We're entering our last couple of minutes here. And I appreciate your time, Darren. Hopefully we can do this again on different topics, but give some words of wisdom to people that are starting out. Maybe they don't know where to start with FHIR, and, anything else you want to.
If I were to go back, say, a few years to when I started using FHIR for the first time as a developer, which is what I was back then, I would say if you were in my position back then, start by installing a FHIR server yourself, whether on your laptop, PC, whatever. Run some test data in there, start writing queries, start looking at the raw data, the JSON. That's what it's all about. And familiarize yourself with the different data types in FHIR. That's a good starting point from the technical side.
Great advice. And I think that all of that is very easy and simple. You don't have to be an expert in anything. You could probably get started in 15, 20 minutes with some of these readily available resources. There's more and more resources out there to get going quickly.
There is. There are Docker instances of FHIR servers you can install. There are whole patient test data sets you can run in quite quickly, post them directly into your FHIR server. There are sample queries you can run. So a lot of free tools out there to do this as well.
So what are your plans for the summer? Are you going somewhere nice, Darren? What is next after Dev Days?
No, taking it easy this week and getting into this book again next week, and more work, I'm afraid. A few meetings coming up about this HL7 Ireland thing, but we'll see where that goes. Fingers crossed.
Okay, so I would like to invite you, if you're going to come to the HL7 Connectathon in Pittsburgh in September. That's where I'm based, and I'm organizing a FHIR dinner. I don't know if you've heard of those, with Bill Lackman. He's the one that's been having those in around DC area. So if you're around, please let me know. Would love to have you. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, thanks, Darren.
Cheers.